Good afternoon. Welcome to Responding to a Cyber Attack with Missiles in South Seas ABE with Mikko Hypponen. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay Oceanside and Shoreline Ballrooms on Level 2 during the day and for the welcome reception at 5:30 tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall on Level 2. Join us for the Pony Awards in Lagoon JKL at 18:30. Thank you for putting your phone on vibrate. It makes it easier for us to ignore the ringing while you wait for your voicemail to pick up. And with that, let us welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much. My name is Mikko. I am the Chief Research Officer for F-Secure Corporation, which is an international cybersecurity company headquartered in Helsinki, which is in Finland, which is in Europe. And Finland is a small country, 5 million people with a very big neighbor, the biggest country on the planet, Russia. And this has put my home country always in a position where we carefully have to think about what we do regarding our foreign policy and also about how we fight our wars. Both my grandfathers fought the Russians in the Second World War. And today we are speaking about war and conflict. War and conflict in a new domain. And as I was thinking about how this cyber world, if you will, has changed around us over the last years, I was actually going through old photos and I found pictures I took here in Vegas 15 years ago at DEF CON, when DEF CON was still in Alexis Park. And I noticed that one of the talks I took a photo of, I don't actually recognize who the speakers are, but the topic they're speaking about already back then is cyber warfare. So we've been thinking about this for quite a while, but what's happening right now is that we are getting closer and closer to real-world implications, where the borders between virtual and real are going away. Our world is more and more virtual. We are living 50% of our daily lives somewhere else than in the real world, in our phones, on our devices, in a world where geography doesn't exist and doesn't matter, or it matters in a different way. So, when there are governmental operations, military operations, or intelligence agency operations in that world, how should we respond in the real world? There's been policy decisions on this already many years ago.
The Pentagon has concluded in its first ever review of international cyber attacks that computer sabotage emanating from another country can constitute an act of war.
So Pentagon already made declarations about this 10 years ago, that cyber attacks are acts of war and they reserve the right to respond with any means necessary, including kinetic attacks. This is not new. However, it's very easy to say these things, and it's much different to do these things. And the reason why it's so hard is basically one word: attribution. The difference between virtual attacks or cyber attacks, when you compare it to any other kinds of aggression, is that they are so hard to attribute. Cyber weapons make sense. Cyber weapons are cheap, effective, and they are deniable. When you have a cheap weapon, when you have an effective weapon which you can deny that it wasn't yours, if that's not the perfect weapon, it's getting very close to a perfect weapon. So regardless of what the policies say, that we reserve the right to respond with missiles against your cyber attack, how actually do you know who launched the attack? And if your enemy knows that you will respond with real-world attacks, the obvious tactic would then be that you mask your own attacks to be coming from another enemy of yours. Reroute your attacks through another country, make it look like it's someone else. False flag. And false flag attacks in cyber domain are very real. When we look at the kind of operations done by intelligence agencies, we have seen cases where national intelligence agencies have tried to make it look like it's another country that's behind a cyber attack, including technical details like hosting your control and command servers in IP addresses in countries that you would like to fake to be the real source of the attacks, even to the details like we've seen Russians generate bait files for their APT attacks using the Mandarin Chinese version of Word. The only reason why they would do that is just to make it look like it's the Chinese when it really is the Russians. So, attribution. How are you ever going to be able to respond with real-world weapons against a cyber attack if you are not sure who's behind it? We'll get back to this. Because first we have to define a little bit. Like, okay, we're speaking about cyber weapons, cyber war, cyber attacks, cyber sex. Well, no, not the last one. What do we actually mean by all of this? Jeff actually touched upon this morning when he was speaking about the 5 domains. 5 domains of war. When the mankind started fighting each other, obviously the first weapons we had only worked on land. You know, sword and bow and arrow. Then we expanded as technology got better. We got technology which built us ships, so we got sea war, then we got planes, so we got air war, then we got satellites and shit, so space war, and eventually cyberspace war. Technology has always shaped the face of conflict, it has always shaped the face of war. But the innovation of a new domain doesn't make the old domains go away. Innovation of sea war didn't make land war go away. Conflict just expanded from land to sea. So these new domains have expanded where we can fight our wars and fight our conflicts. And it's not going to end here. As Jeff said in the morning, cyber domain is different from the other domains. In fact, all of these domains are different from each other. But cyber is probably more different than any other domain out there. And it's not going to be the last. The fact that we have now 5 places where we can fight our wars is not going to be forever 5. There will be eventually a 6th domain or 7th domain. It's going to happen. And it's going to be really hard right now for us to imagine what those future domains for conflict, future domains for war will be. Whatever we can imagine, it's going to be really, it's going to sound like science fiction. Because the next domain after cyber for war isn't going to be incremental change, like, robots and drones. Well, this is the obvious one. This is not a new domain. The fact that we can expand the functionality of an existing domain, like, air war or land war, to be more effective by using machines doesn't really change the domain. To have a new domain, a 6th domain for fighting wars would have to be something revolutionary. So how about, DNA warfare, where you would use attacks which would modify our DNAs to fight your enemies, or nano warfare, where, for example, your enemy would distribute nanobots in your country by, for example, spraying them in the air, which would enter the bloodstream of your soldiers, eventually going to their brains to change their thoughts. Does that sound like science fiction? Yes, it does. Just like cyber war sounded like science fiction 30 years ago. So we don't really know yet what the next domain will be, but there will be more domains where we fight our wars. One obvious technological revolution which is happening very quickly around us right now is the development of machine learning-based intelligence systems, or if you will, artificial intelligence. This could be the next domain, or it could maybe morph to be part of the cyber realm. We don't yet know. But it's highly likely that the race to artificial intelligence is going to generate more conflict, not make less conflict, but generate more conflict in the near term. And defining what we even mean by this development is hard. But I suppose one of the easiest ways to think about artificial intelligence, which would be as intelligent as a human, would be through brain simulators. It's fairly easy for us to imagine a massive data center which would be able to simulate or emulate every single neuron in a human brain so well it would actually be the same as a human brain. We're still decades away from being able to do that, but I guess eventually we will be able to do that. And once we're able to do that, then we do have, for all practical purposes, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence. Initially, such intelligence would be as intelligent as we, but much slower. But we all know what happens with technology. It gets better and better, faster and faster, and that's why it would eventually be superior. If it would only emulate or simulate human brains, but it would be able to do it at gazillion times faster than a real human, then it would be superior. We couldn't compete. A friend of mine says that whenever he sees the word AI, for some reason he doesn't see it as uppercase A, uppercase I. He sees it as a lowercase l. So A-L, like Al, like, Weird Al. Weird AI. And by the way, I'm not sure if you know this, but you should know that Weird Al Yankovic is playing tonight here in Vegas. True story. It might be sold out, but he's in town tonight. An artificial intelligence is going to shape the face of conflicts, and you don't have to take that from me. You can take that from President Putin.
Искусственный интеллект – это будущее не только России, это будущее всего человечества. Здесь колоссальные возможности и трудно прогнозируемые сегодня угрозы. Тот, кто станет лидером в этой сфере, будет властелином мира.
Tot liderom mira. Whoever rules artificial intelligence will rule the world. So why would this race to these new technological revolutions generate more conflict instead of less conflict? Well, it's quite clear that if an entity would announce that they are getting close to having superior artificial intelligence, superhuman intelligence at their disposal, most likely that entity would not be a country, it wouldn't be a government, it would be a company. It would be Google, Apple, IBM, Microsoft, one of these. Now, just imagine one of these companies would announce that they are, or they already do have superior intelligence, or they're getting close to, like, making the breakthrough. All other players, including all other foreign governments, would realize that if someone else comes up with superhuman intelligence, it is game over. They will now win everything. They will win every competition. They will win with superior products and superior plans. They will win every conflict. They will win every war. So no matter what, that technology must be stolen. And if it cannot be stolen, it must be destroyed. That's what's going to generate more conflict, not less conflict. So this race to AI is a scary race. If we get close to actually having this at our disposal, other entities, including other countries and other governments, will not sit idly by. If they can't be first, they will do whatever it takes to steal it or destroy it. Race to AI is a scary race. But we're not there yet. One question I hear a lot about artificial intelligence is about malicious use in our world. So cyber attacks using machine learning or cyber attacks using intelligence systems. And we are actually not really seeing that. We see very isolated, typically academic examples on how it could be done. The only practical cases where machine learning is being abused by attackers are cases where attackers are trying to poison the learning systems used by the good guys. So all of you who work in computer security industry know that you've been using machine learning for years. We started our machine learning systems 8 years ago. So there's nothing new here. Defenders have been using learning systems and machine learning for defense for years and years. Attackers know this. Attackers have been trying to poison the learning systems we use. For example, systems which try to categorize spam with attacks for quite a while. But what they haven't done yet is to launch actual attacks which would learn. So why haven't we seen this? I guess the main reason is very practical. There's such a lack of talent in artificial intelligence and machine learning and data analyst world that if you know how to build anything like this, you don't have to go into life of crime. You will get a well-paid job anywhere on the planet. This is the situation today. But it's not going to last for much longer. It's not going to last for more than a couple of years more, because eventually someone will make it easy enough. Someone will lower the bar low enough. Right now, if you want to use a system like, I don't know, TensorFlow, you have to be a computer science student or grad. Eventually, you can be any idiot. Eventually, any idiot will be able to use machine learning systems because they become easy enough to use. This is going to happen in 2 to 3 years. And then we will start seeing attacks which will be using machine learning and artificial intelligence in their world because it's easy enough to use. All right, so let's speak about the powers at play, the countries that have the capability to do cyber attacks, to fight in this new domain. Who's the best? Well, we are in the best. The United States of America has been investing more money, more manpower for a longer time than any other government on the planet. No question. It's quite clear who is number one. But then we have the rest of the world. We have the Russians, we have the North Koreans, we have the Iranians, we have the Chinese. So let me play you a video clip from 2015 where Obama is commenting about his view on the balance of power between cyber power of USA and cyber power of China.
And so, for example, I'm going to be getting a visit from President Xi of China, a state visit here coming up in a couple of weeks. We've made very clear to the Chinese that there are certain practices that they're engaging in that we know are emanating from China and are not acceptable. And, you know, we can choose to make this an area of competition, which I guarantee you we'll win if we have to. Or alternatively, we can come to an agreement in which we say, this isn't helping anybody. Let's instead try to have some basic rules of the road in terms of how we operate. Now, as I said, there's still going to be individual actors. There are going to be terrorist networks and others. So we're still going to have to build a strong defense. But one of our first and most important efforts has to be to get the states that may be sponsoring cyber attacks to understand that you know, there comes a point at which we consider this a core national security threat, and we will treat it as such.
There's an excellent question from one of our cyber warriors here at Fort Meade, Maryland.
He looks like he knows what he's doing.
I miss this guy. I don't even live in this country, and I miss this guy. But if you paid attention to what he said about the capabilities, he said that between USA and China, he would rather not make it a competition. He would not actually start to fight. But if they would have to fight, he would assure that they would win. And he would probably be right. And China is one of the stronger powers at play. But this world is asymmetric, especially when we look at these smaller countries. They don't have nearly as much to lose as, for example, China would. And this is especially evident with North Korea. When we look at what's been happening regarding the cyber attacks against the rest of the world from North Korea, this is the outlier. We can look at every single governmental attack we've ever seen from any of the players, and we can put all of the attacks we've seen into two different groups. Either it's been about spying or about intelligence gathering, group number one, or it's been about sabotage or actual warfare, group number two. Everything is either spying or sabotage, except North Korea. North Korea has done spying and sabotage, but they've also done theft. And there's no other government on this planet which would resort to stealing from other governments to try to fix their budget deficit. But that's exactly what North Korea has done. We actually released a paper last week. This picture is from the paper regarding the attacks from North Korea. If you want to download the paper, it's called Cyber Threat Landscape for the Finance Sector, where we speak about financial sector in particular as a target, because many of these attacks from North Korea have been targeting financial sector in order to steal money. Some of it targets traditional financial sector, some of it targets especially cryptocurrency exchanges, because they want money which is anonymous and untrackable, which cryptocurrencies are. So that is the outlier, a government which is willing to do attacks where they are stealing money to fix their budget deficit. It's an outlier in many other ways. We haven't seen any other government which would launch attacks against foreign private companies in order to protest against movies. But as you remember from 5 years ago, this is exactly what happened. As Sony Pictures announced, they would be about to release a movie where the climax of the movie would look like this. That is Kim Jong-un. And there is no point for me to try to speak anything on top of this, because we will all be watching this anyway. And yes, he does die in the movie, and I'm sorry if I spoiled the plot to you, but it's not a very good movie. So why is North Korea important? Well, it's important because nuclear. Any country like this isn't really a problem at world scale unless they have access to weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons changed the world, quite obviously. We would all agree on that. They ended the Second World War, and they are a prime example of deterrence at play. However, when you think about nuclear weapons, that is also a prime example of how technology changes conflict. Nuclear weapons were planned and built by people like us, by the nerds and geeks of their generation. And you could argue that nuclear physicists lost their innocence in 1945 when we, the mankind, for the first time used the power of the atom to kill. And if that's true, then you could claim exactly in the same way that computer scientists lost their innocence in 2011 when Stuxnet was launched against the Bushehr nuclear facilities in Iran with an attack which had the power to kill people. Nuclear scientists lost their innocence in 1945, computer scientists in 2011. Stuxnet is a landmark case in our world, pretty obviously. That's Stuxnet in Persian, if you didn't know the language. I actually picked that up from a site called infographics.ir. IR is the Iranian TLD, where they have plenty of interesting infographics about what cyber attacks really look like. Now, there is time before Stuxnet and time after Stuxnet. That's how crucial it is in our world. It really changed the way we think about how a virtual attack affects the real world and how governments can use that to actually execute their policies. Now, when I say Stuxnet had the power to kill people, obviously it did, because it violently broke centrifuges which were filled with uranium gas. If there were any people close to it when it happened, they would die. We don't actually know if anybody died, just directly because of the Stuxnet code. Of course, plenty of people did die indirectly. Also, people in our line of work, because plenty of computer security people have died because of the attacks against the Iranian nuclear program. For example, this guy, Mr. Ahmadi, who was a specialist in cyber defenses, was assassinated in Iran. And there's been at least 2 car bombs. This is the car of Mr. Majid Jahriari, who was a computer security expert in Iran, killed because of his skills. And whenever computer security experts are killed, regardless of where they are in the world, it doesn't really feel very nice, does it? Because we are computer security experts ourselves. Which brings us to this year. Israeli Defense Forces tweeted pretty much exactly 6 months ago about an operation they had executed against Hamas, where they had launched missiles to take down an operations center at the Gaza Strip. And that operations center wasn't building bombs, it wasn't doing propaganda for Hamas, it was doing cyber attacks. And this becomes now a fine line. Obviously, nobody would bat an eyelid if they launch a missile against a bomb building factory. They've launched missiles against propaganda building places before, which isn't directly killing anyone, but it's very clearly connected to the Hamas operations. But now when it was actually a cyber center, it did feel different. It did feel like we had crossed another line. Was this again a similar event where we would speak about time before this event and then time after the event? Maybe. Now, the fact that attribution here wasn't hindering the real-world response is important to think about. In this case, they knew perfectly well who they were fighting. They had enough know-how, maybe insiders who knew where these cyber operations were physically coming from. They had people on the ground, most likely. They had been watching the physical building before they launched attacks against it. They had enough confidence to believe that attribution was accurate. For most cyber attacks, this is not the case. And also, it's important that they're not just responding to only a cyber attack. Obviously, Hamas has been actively sending missiles against Israel themselves. If it would be only cyber attacks, it would be a different question. But when it's part of a bigger picture, it changes. This is also a good example on open source intelligence. Because when the Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson tweeted about this operation they had done, he included an aerial image of the building they had just bombed. So what did I do? Well, I tweeted about this, that, hey, does anybody happen to know where this building is? 5 hours later, someone replies with the coordinates. This is what we call open source intelligence. There's always someone somewhere who knows where things are, or who can actually go on location and double check these things. And this means that we are in a very practical arms race. Now, when I spoke about nuclear weapons, I said that they are also a perfect example on the power of deterrence. And the power of traditional weapons is very much in deterrence. If you have Traditional weapons that you can show in military parades, you don't have to use them. Or you hope that you don't have to use them. In most cases, you don't. It's enough to have them. Nuclear weapons have been used in actual war 2 times in mankind's history. The rest of the power of the tens of thousands of active nuclear warheads on this planet right now is not in using them, it's in having them, and then doing nuclear testing to show your enemies that you have them. There are 11 countries on this planet which have nuclear weapons right now. Everybody knows which those countries are. And when you know that a country has nuclear weapons, then you don't pick a fight with those countries because they have nuclear weapons. This is how deterrence works. We know exactly which countries have nuclear weapons. We know exactly which countries have aircraft carriers. We know exactly which countries have fighter jets and tanks. We know how many tanks. We know where they are. In fact, how do we know this? How do we know how many fighter jets a country has? Well, you Google for it. It's on Wikipedia. We show these publicly in military parades. You can see how many fighter jets the Russians have. You can see how many planes North Korea has. Fun fact, North Korea, according to Wikipedia, has 84 choppers illegally obtained by circumventing the US export controls. How the hell do you get 84 choppers without, I don't know. Now, this means that the power of weapons has been more in deterrence than in actually using them. And this power does not apply to cyber weapons. Cyber weapons have no deterrence power, or they haven't had deterrence power so far, because we have no idea who has what. We know that all developed nations are developing cyber defenses and cyber offenses. Everybody's doing this. So, a question. What is the offensive cyber capability of Italy, or New Zealand, or Vietnam? We have no idea. We don't know. So what kind of deterrence do these tools build? Nothing. There's no deterrence power in weapons that nobody knows about. And this is made more problematic by the fact that weapons rust. Traditional weapons rust, they have a limited lifespan. Cyber weapons rust too. In many cases, they rust much quicker. Imagine a typical exploit, which would be a building block for a weapon. Let's say a 0-day in Microsoft Windows. You know that your enemies use Windows in many systems, both civilian and military. And if you have an unknown 0-day which grants you access to all of those installations, great. But it's not going to work forever. It might work for a very limited amount of time because systems change, new versions of operating systems come into play, and the vendors might find the vulnerabilities and fix them. Your cyber weapons rust. They have limited lifespans. So put yourselves in the shoes of a general who's investing millions and millions into building weapons. When he's investing into traditional weapons, like fighter jets, well, they have deterrence power. You don't have to use them. They have a lifespan of 30, 40 years. You can show them in parades. You get bang for the buck. But when you do investments of millions into cyber weapons, nobody knows you have them. And they only work for a limited time. Then they expire and you have to delete them and you get no bang for the buck, no return on your investment whatsoever. And this problem makes it more likely that cyber weapons actually end up being used. Now, I'm not claiming that somebody would start, using weapons just because they have them. No. What I'm saying is that militaries might end up giving weapons that they've built, which are reaching the end of their lifetime, to intelligence agencies. That, we have this thing which you could use to gain access to every Windows on the planet. It's not going to work for much longer. Maybe you could use it for something, because we haven't had any wars recently to use it in. This is the scenario which is very likely to happen, because cyber weapons have no deterrence power. So how do we solve this? Well, one way is to try to get deterrence power for cyber weapons as well. How do we do that? How do you do a military parade for cyber weapons? Oh, well, you could have public demonstrations of cyber power, like war games where you use cyber attacks to showcase how effective they are in the hopes of building deterrence power in the hopes of scaring your enemies, showing how good you are in offensive use of cyber. Now, we haven't seen any country do that yet, but it could very well be that this could change. And maybe that's what we need if we want to fight cyber mutually assured destruction, because this is a very different world. When you think about kinetic warfare, we have enough warheads on this planet to kill everybody on the planet many times over. What would the similar attack look like in our domain, in cyber domain? Modern societies run on computers. The food you ate today was made in factories which are running on computers. The water you drink is being built or bottled in factories controlled by computers. Our societies run on electricity and computers. And when we face governmental attacks, cyber is the next domain we have to be defending. And this is a lesson that has to be learned not just by government, but also by private companies, because private companies control a very big part of our critical infrastructure. And when companies face attacks by governments, these attacks are very, very different. Most attacks which hit private companies are coming from criminals. Criminals who don't really want to attack you. Criminals who just want money. I mean, they're not really after you. They want money. And if it's too hard, too slow, too expensive to attack you, they will go after an easier target. They will go after the low-hanging fruit. And believe me when I tell you that the internet is a garden of low-hanging fruit. They can easily find easier targets to make money. But when the attacker is not after money, when the attacker is a governmental attacker, typically then the attacker is from a military organization. And what military people do is that they follow orders. So the order has been, you go, you break into that organization, you steal this information, you report back when you've stolen it. Well, that's what they're going to do. And if they can't do it, they will try again until they will succeed. They will keep repeating, they will try different attacks until they succeed. This is why we call APTs advanced persistent threats. They are persistent. They don't give up. Normal attackers give up. Governmental attackers don't. That's why they get in. If you just keep on trying over and over again, eventually you will get in. And when we look at all the countries on the planet, who is most exposed in cyber war? Well, United States of America is most exposed. This is the most reliant country on the planet on technology. And when you look at countries that USA is having a beef with right now, those countries are not nearly as reliant on technology as USA. This is how asymmetric the situation is. And it's not just about attacking governments and military targets. A legitimate target can be a private company as well. This is defined in the Geneva Convention. And the definition, as I read it, the way I read it, would actually tell me that, for example, during time of war, the company that I work for would be a legitimate military target. For example, legitimate military target for bombing, which doesn't feel too good. This is map of Ruoholahti area in Helsinki, where our headquarters is. The bombs you see overlaid on the map are bombs from the last war. One of them is right dead center on top of our headquarters. And I really wouldn't want to see that again. So the question becomes, should we be responding to cyber attacks with missiles? And the answer is yes, probably. Yes, we should. If the attacker isn't doing only cyber attacks, if this attack is part of a bigger conflict, if there are all domains in play, if you can do the attribution, then there's no reason why you wouldn't be attacking or responding with missiles against a virtual attack. Maybe the more interesting question is the other way around. Should we be responding to missile attacks with cyber? Is that enough? Do we have now enough capability in cyber attacks that they would be more devastating than real-world attacks? Cyber war. Or to quote a philosopher of our ages, Mr. Kruk, total cyber war. Because once you are already in conflict, once you enter total war, if you're already in conflict where kinetic power is at play, nothing restricts you from using cyber power to the full extent that you have it at your disposal. With that, I'd like to end by thanking you about the work that we, the people in our line of business, do. Because rarely is anyone thanked for the work they did to prevent the disaster that did not happen. And this, I believe, is more true in our line of business than in most other businesses anywhere. Because what we do is like Tetris. It's like Tetris. When you're successful, the success disappears. When you screw up, the mistakes pile up. Thank you for your work. And now we open it up for questions. We have microphones here at the corridors. Please walk to the mic and we'll get the questions in. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Any questions? We have a question coming up over there. Thank you very much.
This isn't related to kinetic missiles, but I just wanted your opinion on, and there's a bill that's going through in the US on hackback and how private organizations take offensive measures against potential nation states that might be attacking.
So you mean private companies using offensive response?
Yes, the term is hackback.
Yeah, hackback, yeah. Yeah, that is, I think it's more really a question for lawyers than people in technology. Responding to an active attack by hacking back in one way or another isn't really technically very hard. You have the same attribution problem. You might be attacking back against the wrong target, but if you're certain who the attacker is, of course you can attack back, maybe even steal your own information back. But then lawyers might disagree with what you're doing. We actually had a very interesting discussion about this within our company as we were discussing some ideas about collecting information about attackers with booby trap systems. And a lawyer brought up an old case about a guy who had a summer cottage which kept on getting burglarized. So he built a trap system which actually had a rifle right behind the door, and the next burglar got killed. And this was their reason why they believed we shouldn't be building hackback systems, which I'm not really sure if I agree, but that's the argument they had. We have another question from there. Thank you.
Yes, with the issue of attribution, we see actual attacks like the chemical attacks in Syria create an issue of attribution there. If there is an asymmetric domain, such as cyber, how do we prevent attribution and those false flag attacks from small actors that wish to cause large-scale conflicts?
There is no easy solution into fixing this. You can imagine yourself trying to build a false flag attack. You could go through, jump through massive amount of hoops to make it very convincing that the attacker isn't you, but someone else. And I don't see any mechanism, because the attackers are not really listening to what we're telling them. They will definitely figure out ways to bypass any mechanisms that we currently use for attribution. And this is why I made the conclusion that when you're fighting against an attacker which is only doing cyber, I don't think we should be responding with missiles. But when it's part of a bigger conflict, then it's pretty obvious what's at play and who are the attackers and why they're doing what they're doing. Most of the attribution work which is being done nowadays, well, big part of it is based on the victims. You look at the attacker, you link their different attacks together, you look at who the victims are, and quite often that tells you who the attacker is. But that's not really strong enough to start shooting missiles with. So this is one of the core problems we have, and I don't really see an easy way of fixing that. Thank you. And yes, please.
So there's this sovereign internet law in Russia with the stated aim to protect them in case we all decide to shut them off the internet. They'll still be fine. It also has the effect that they can choose to shut themselves off from the internet once they finish building it out. So I picture a major cyber attack, and they flip the switch. So your cyber retaliation is impossible. Is this a crazy idea?
We often say that the internet has no geography, that there's no distances, there's no borders. That's actually not true. Internet does have geography, and I actually think the amount of geography on the internet is actually increasing over time. If you look at the internet 20 years ago and today, we actually have more borders and more distances between two countries on the internet. And we're actually going to the wrong direction in that sense. Being able to disconnect completely is easy to say, hard to do. Like, how do you actually disconnect in a world where individuals within your country have satellite links which link them to the rest of the world? And since we're speaking about TCP/IP, it's enough to have just a handful of links, and then traffic will reroute to the rest of the internet within that country. So disconnection isn't really something that most topologies would actually support. You can't actually flip the switch that easily. Yeah, sure, Russians speak about trying or actually doing a rehearsal on doing that later this year. It's going to fail. I don't see how on earth they would be able to successfully really disconnect from the rest of the internet. It's very hard to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll have the last question. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's you.
Thank you. Mikko, thank you for your talk. Really insightful and posed some interesting ideas. I've been researching, I'm at the University of Cambridge, I've been researching a little bit about the existential threat of cyber warfare, which some US military generals now playing down in turn thinking of what they call the sixth domain, which is human ideas. And the idea that the subversion techniques used with election interference, for example, and that sort of thing, is where a lot of the battles are taking place. So it's not an existential threat, but rather the battle of ideas, and that you have to counter these propaganda or subversion techniques in very different ways to building these traditional weapons. We're wondering if you had any ideas on that as well.
Yeah, it gets very hard to define where the actual conflict begins when you introduce or when you include information operations as part of a conflict or part of war. Clearly, during traditional wartime, propaganda and information operations or election meddling would be considered acts of war. But when you don't have an active conflict between two countries and one country tries to meddle with your elections, is that actually war? Is that something you could retaliate against? This is very problematic, and I don't really see I don't really think that's going to change. Sure, people's minds and opinions are part of the operations during any conflict, but it's hard to define these as acts of war unless there is real war. And we have less and less real wars, which is of course good, but it also means that we have more and more conflicts where nobody declares a war. Russia and Ukraine have been at war for 5 years. Everybody agrees it's a war. There's never been a declared war between these two countries. And with that, thank you very much.